Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today we are discussing Romantic Manifesto by Ayn Rand. And today's topic is sense of life. This is one of my favorite topics. So Rob, what is
All right.
sense of
Well,
life?
I'm apparently the designated reader. So
nice booming voice.
yes, I'm going to read this passage as basically the third and fourth paragraph of the article Philosophy and Sense of Life. And this is the passage where Ayn Rand defines what she means by a sense of life and describes it. A sense of life is a pre-conceptual equivalent of metaphysics, an emotional, subconsciously integrated appraisal of man and of existence. It sets the nature of a man's emotional responses and the essence of his character. Long before he is old enough to grasp such a concept as metaphysics, man makes choices, forms value judgments, experiences emotions, and acquires a certain implicit view of life. Every choice and value judgment implies some estimate of himself and of the world around him, most particularly of his capacity to deal with the world. He may draw conscious conclusions, which may be true or false, or he may remain mentally passive and merely react to events, i.e. merely feel. Whatever the case may be, his subconscious mechanism sums up his psychological activities, integrating his conclusions, reactions, or evasions into an emotional sum that establishes a habitual pattern and becomes his automatic response to the world around him. What began as a series of single, discrete conclusions or evasions about his own particular problems becomes a generalized feeling about existence, an implicit metaphysics with the compelling motivational power of a constant basic emotion, an emotion which is part of all his other emotions and underlies all his experiences. This is a sense of life.
Excellent. So what we are going to do, folks, we're going to have first Sherry, then Marisa and Rob talk about their take on philosophy and sense of life, this chapter. This is, I think, chapter 2. And then we're going to open it up to, then each panelist gets to put one question on the table, and then we'll take Q&A from the audience, and we'll do breakout rooms and takeaways. All right, Sherry?
Yep. Okay, so I wasn't expecting that Shrikant would have Rob read that, but it's perfect pitch to what I was thinking of doing. What I wanted to do is take that philosophical discussion and bring it down to a very visual analogy, to talk about it in a way that maybe makes it a little bit more immediate for all of us. So we all have a real basis of what we're talking about. So the first thing I wanted to mention was we've probably all have experienced a situation where we've met somebody for the very first time and had that immediate sense of either great like or great dislike, just bolt out of the blue, instantaneous kind of response. I would imagine, I'll nod your heads if you know what I'm talking about. It's that kind of, yeah. That is two things. That is their sense of life being projected and your sense of life reacting to it. So last time we talked a little bit about art being both something that talks about it's what the artist is saying and also how the viewer is responding to it. It's a similar kind of thing with sense of life. It's both everything about that person is reflected and everything about your person is reacting to it. And so sometimes you have those situations where it's just, you feel like you got hit by lightning, with either a good way or a bad way. It can happen in either case. I'm sitting next to one of those people that I've had that reaction to. And Shrikant is another one of those people that I had that instantaneous reaction to when I met him. But I wanted to kind of talk about how this sense of life, what it is and how it's created in a more visual way that I think is really helpful. Or maybe it's not helpful for you, but it is for me. She talks about how the sense of life, your subconscious is the recorder, and your the record it creates is your sense of life. And we talk about how it's at such an early age that you're creating this kind of record. And I think if anybody has been around infants enough different infants over a period of time, you'll notice babies actually come out with almost a temperament. I wouldn't say that they have a sense of life yet, but they generally have a temperament. There's babies who are just chill. There are babies who are just frankly fussy. And I wouldn't go so far as to say it was anything more serious than just a temperament. And sometimes that temperament is changed. People can have experiences in their life where they become, maybe if they were fussy, they become less so later on. But I know people that I met as infants and that were fussy, particular fuss budget kind of people. And 30, 40 years later, they are still that way. So there's a kernel, there's a starting point, I think, for each of us at that stage. But then it's all those experiences through our lives. And I like to think of it like it's a seabed. And all of those experiences and our reaction to them sort of settle down and make some sort of like sedimentary rock. And that sedimentary rock's full of all those individual particles, all those individual experiences. And yes, you can change them. They can get, upended. Some major event will happen in your life, and all of a sudden you have an emotion that is tied to something that happened so long ago, you don't really, it wasn't in your conscious memory at the time, but all of a sudden, poof, right there it is. That's sort of like, the seabed floor getting upended, and all of a sudden, all of those things are fresh and up at the top again. It's kind of that sort of a sense. But when we think of that, and in this chapter, Ayn Rand kind of mentions that all you really need to do is fix your explicit philosophy, and then the sense of life will just fall into place. But and I think that's just she breezed past that a little bit, and because elsewhere she talks about how a sense of life is created. It's much slower. Rob will probably get it. Maybe he'll get into this in his part of this, about how it's not just an automatic switch, because for it to work naturally and without it being stilted, it has to be built up again. So if you go and change your explicit philosophy, you need to still have that natural emotion, that's natural reaction to unwind, maybe something you were trying to fix in your implicit philosophy. But you've got to make sure that your implicit philosophy is always left to its natural self. You can't, I've seen cases where people say, oh, well, I'm just operating on my explicit philosophy, but you watch them in their daily life and they're actually operating by their implicit emotional side, and that's what's driving them. So if you think you can have one without the other, you're sadly mistaken. So I like to think of the two, the implicit and explicit philosophy, almost like the difference between mono speaker and stereophonic sound. So if you're using both at the same time, they're a wonderful tool. They really complement one another. If you're using only one or only the other, and we probably all know somebody that is like that uses only one or the other, you're really kind of running through life with a mono speaker, and you're missing so much that's available to you.
Oh, I love the analogy of mono and stereo, and it's like it's two kind of parallel navigation systems.
Mm-hmm.
One is automatic, and that's going to give you immediate responses, and then you have, with the explicit philosophy, you have a way of actually reasoning about that and seeing whether it is right, whether it is wrong, making adjustments. But the explicit philosophy is not going to immediately for the first time give you those reactions. And over time, you kind of, by having both these things active, you make sure that everything that you value at the explicit level gets pushed into that.
Mhm.
And the other part about the sense of life that I think is important is that it forms when you are a child, when you do not have the capacity of explicit reasoning. This is very, it's very early. Um, Everything you're getting through kind of imitation and kind of reaction. And most people do not actually examine that.
Mhm.
They just take it as given, because it does have that feel of being, okay, that's just me. But having this stereo capacity allows you to actually navigate. It's like a ship moving. It has a tremendous amount of momentum, which is your subconscious, but you have the ability, you have the rudder to be able to move it.
Mhm.
Wonderful. Marisa, you're next.
Okay. To go off of, I'm going to build a little bit upon what Sherry was just telling us. The, the aspect of, I love the analogy of the mono versus the stereo. That's a great way to envision it. Ayn Rand does tell us, she says that our implicit sense of life, it is with us from birth, as Shrikant just said. She does clarify that. So this one is one of my favorite chapters in the book, and I find it to be like maybe the most integral of the entire book. So what she's telling us here, she's first she's making a very declarative statement, and she's saying man cannot escape the fact that he needs a philosophy in life. He needs a philosophy of life that is a basic, comprehensive view of himself and his relationship to existence. And she makes this statement. I don't think she makes that explicitly in the book, but I've heard her in several other chats she's had, speaking of art and philosophy. And she tells us that the only choice that we have is whether we form our philosophy by a process of thought or by accidental emotional associations, or if we hold it consciously or subconsciously, whether it is true or false. So she says those are your few options that you have. You must have a philosophy. It's just a couple different directions you can go. In this chapter, she provides a path forward for consciously determining in which direction we want our sense of life to be. Now, this sense of life is, it's the emotional aspect. It brings in the emotional aspect. So the emotion that that philosophy is trying to intellectually motivate within us is revealed by art. And as such, Ayn Rand is telling us that art is not optional. It's a crucial part of life. Now, and that's where we see where she connects the philosophy with art. Philosophy is a requirement, but yet so is art. She says that if art provides and completes a philosophical mission, it provides us with a philosophical focus. And it's what's going to inspire, motivate, or fuel within us that those philosophical things which we hold true, or even that we're striving to hold as true. Even I would even go so far as to say, to the extent that you don't experience art, it will make you poor spiritually. And it's vital for everyone to seek it out and to find avenues towards it. Because when what you're doing is you are finding the emotional path towards solidifying your philosophy or your values, what makes you, you, as it were. Thank you.
Thank you, Marisa. Next, one point I want to make is that in addition to art, I think as Sherry pointed out, it's in your reaction to people that you can see it. So those are the two, very clear areas where you can see your sense of life operative. You can say you have a reaction to art, yes, similarly, or no.
Yes.
Similarly, you have that reaction to
Right.
people.
It's both art. The creator and the viewer are both affected, and it helps them solidify their own sense of life.
Yes. So in that sense, art is a selective recreation of philosophy, and so is you. Like, each person is a creation. We are beings of self-made soul. So we put our philosophy in our person, in our character. And so that in that sense, we are works of art, and other people react to that in a similar way. Next up is Rob.
Okay. A lot of really interesting stuff here. I've got some things to say maybe later about this issue of mono versus stereo and the need to pay attention to both, which I think is very interesting. And also about this question Marisa raised about, how and why, under what circumstances, and through what means you would try to change your sense of life or shape it. But I wanted to talk about something that I've actually got a movie recommendation, because it's basically somebody made a movie out of this chapter, not intending to do so.
Not intending.
But in a way they did. It's a movie, a 1998 film called, I'm just gonna recommend it to everybody to check it out. It'll mean a lot if you've read this chapter. And it's a movie called What Dreams May Come, with Robin Williams, made in 1998. And basically the movie is a dramatization of this first two paragraphs especially this first two paragraphs of this essay. So I'm going to read those first two paragraphs and describe the movie.
An unintended.
Yeah.
Unintended.
It totally comes from a different source, but somebody sort of came to the same idea. So let me just read this. Since religion is a primitive form of philosophy, an attempt to offer a comprehensive view of reality, many of its myths are distorted or dramatized allegories based on some element of truth, some actual, if profoundly elusive, aspect of man's existence. One of such allegories, which men find particularly terrifying, is the myth of a supernatural recorder from whom nothing can be hidden, who lists all of a man's deeds, the good and the evil, the noble and the vile, and who confronts a man with that record on Judgment Day. That myth is true, not existentially, but psychologically. The merciless recorder is the integrating mechanism of a man's subconscious. The record is his sense of life.
And at the end of this chapter, she talks about how that Judgment Day is every day.
Yeah. Well, so the interesting thing about this movie is it's sort of this sort of fantasy supernatural kind of premise, but the idea is that I think I can tell this without giving too much of a spoiler because it happens fairly early in the movie. The main character dies, and when he gets to the afterlife, he wakes up and he is literally inside of his favorite painting. And the movie won an Oscar for visual effects because it was very early CGI, and they actually managed to create this system for filming a scene and then having every pixel of that scene track with a brush stroke. A CGI effect of a brush stroke, so that he's inside of like a living painting where everything around him is made out of brush strokes of paint in a sort of Monet-like impressionist style. And so this idea that the afterlife in this story, the afterlife basically is your reward or punishment in the afterlife is to live inside your sense of life, right? And to live in the world as you see it. And so he, of course, having this benevolent sense of life, basically he's sort of his version is sort of like a bit of like a Maxfield Parrish painting, if you've ever seen those, very bright and sunlit and dramatic and vibrant colors and very benevolent. And then there's a plot line later on with someone who goes to the afterlife and brings with them and they basically go to hell. And what hell means is living inside of a malevolent view of the world, a view of the world in which the world is hostile and everything is destroyed and everything's horrible, and you're focusing entirely on the negative. So this is the idea, and so it's a very powerful idea. And it's, in the medium of film, they do this, using those special effects and other things. They portray it in a brilliant way that's very visual. The idea of what would it be like to live in a world literally shaped by your imagination and by your sense of life, where the world as you think it is becomes what you live in, and the difference that it makes depending on what that view of the world is. I'm going to warn everyone.
It's a weird movie.
It's a deeply weird movie, and there's some strange things about it. So I'm not vouching that you're going to like it, but I think that in the context of this chapter, I think I could not recommend it, because it is so encapsulates this idea of what is your view of life, how does that shape your experience, what would it be like to live inside the world as you see it for eternity, and also really captures the role of art in that, because at several points they have they have references, visual references to famous works of art, and to works of art that appear early on as things that are in people's lives here. During their life on Earth, there was a work of art, and then in the afterlife, they're living inside that work of art. So it's very much all about this idea of what is the relationship of art to sense of life, and what is then this idea of what if your sense of life were the supernatural recorder that's determining whether you go to heaven or hell, right? So I think it's a really interesting movie for dramatizing that idea. And the thing I find interesting is I've had experiences of seeing that in reality. Now, I find interesting what she says about the that Sherry mentioned the passage which says Judgment Day is every day. So I've seen real examples observed real examples of people for whom they are trapped. People do actually become trapped in their sense of life, not in this literal sense of it metaphysically becoming real around them, but in the sense of what the focus of their life is and what they notice and what they don't notice in their lives. So some years ago, this is 20 years ago, I had the experience of meeting with someone who was prominent in my line of work. I'm just going to leave it vague at that. But this is somebody who was older, more established, more successful, and had the opportunity to be a informal meeting at this person's house. So I got a sense of how this person lives. And I was struck immediately by two things. One is that this person had a really great life in a lot of ways, right? He had a really nice house. It was more, like I said, somebody who's established and successful, had a lot of accomplishments, had a lot of position in his career. The second thing that struck me is that this person was extremely dour and was not really able to enjoy any of the great, this great life in terms of the outward circumstances, but wasn't really able to enjoy it. It was very dour and very negative and very complaining about everything all the time, very focused on what's wrong with everything, what's wrong with the world. And I had this experience of realizing at the end of this visit, short visit, that I was going to go home to, an old house that needs lots of repairs that I couldn't afford. And, not knowing exactly where my next paycheck, as a freelancer, not knowing exactly where my next paycheck was going to come from. And my own external circumstances, of life were way worse, but I was going to enjoy it all a lot more because I was able to appreciate the positive things and not focus on and not be obsessing over the negatives. And it reminded me of there's a quote on this that I think is very relevant to this. She talks about this constant basic emotion that determines how the sense of life being a constant basic emotion in your life that affects all your other emotions. And it reminds me of a line from Milton. This is in Paradise Lost. So Satan and the rebel angels have just been cast out of heaven and gone down into the lake of fire, and they're talking amongst each other. And right after Satan says, it's better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven, he says this line: the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. And I think that's absolutely talking about the role sense of life. That you can be in wonderful circumstances, live in a beautiful neighborhood, in a beautiful house, and all these different things, and not enjoy it if your sense of life is causing you to focus or obsess on the negatives. And you can, have a somewhat messier life and enjoy it a lot more if you have a sense of life that focuses on the positives and filters it in a way, filters your experience of life. So we are all in a way trapped in our sense of life. That is a real thing, that we are trapped in our sense of life. Now, I say trapped not in the sense that you can never change it, and we can talk about that later, but that it is what shapes your everyday experience of what your life is and what the world is shaped by what you choose to focus on in your life, what you choose to emphasize, what you choose to let affect you, and what you choose not to let affect you. And that's all a product of your sense of life and how you have directed your sense of life, how you built your sense of life over the years. And so that is the literal truth of this thing she's talking about, this idea of that your sense of life is the recorder that is punishing you or rewarding you depending on how you've created it.
Yeah, that's excellent. I want to connect it up with a couple of concepts, metaphysical concepts that we talked about last time. The concept of normal and important.
Yes.
For example, if a person,
we had this whole conversation about how important is a metaphysical concept last week. And then I get to this chapter and I get like 2 pages in and she has a whole passage about that. And I realized, I must have been in the back of my head.
Yeah.
Excellent. So like for a person, we know people who are anxious, who are always afraid, okay, regardless of anything else. You can put them in a fantastic situation or a horrible situation. They're always anxious about things because they think that it is normal, that's the normal situation. And anything that is negative is important, worth paying attention to. So they're kind of assuming that that's the world, and they're always focused on everything that is negative as important. Whereas there are people who are basically positive people, optimistic people, who say that there is a lot that can be done in the world, and they're always looking for things that they can do. And because their attention is always focused on that, it kind of supports the emotion. So it's like you have this sense of life, and then you have actions that come out of that, which reinforce the same emotions. So it's like a loop that you are kind of caught into.
On the same thing, one of the phrases that's often used at our house is, the punishment is he has to live with who he is.
No, I think that.
Oh, you do it differently.
This first came up between the two of us at a conversation about someone who had gotten something, I think a job or something, somewhere she was working, had gotten a something that they didn't deserve, that she probably should have gotten, and she was upset about it. And I said, well, just remember, their punishment is having to be who they are. I've seen that, but in a lot of cases, a person's punishment for being a rotten person is having to be that person and having to look at the world the way they do and experience the world the way they do.
All right, so now it's time for the panelists to put one question on the table, and I'm going to volunteer myself as a panelist for the moment. So my question is, what is involved in change of sense of life? Because, as we are saying, people are born with a certain sense, it's like not born, there is, even at the born level, there is something. At the kind of physical, biological nature, there is big differences amongst children as soon as they are born. And I can tell from the 2 kids that Rob and Sherry have, that they're different, right from the beginning. And then there is kind of early childhood, where children, all of us, kind of almost absorb a sense of life from people around you and our circumstances. Then we get the ability of being able to reflect on it, to kind of develop explicit philosophy. So what is involved in changing a sense of life?
You want to take that one?
Well, we had a conversation about this that sort of we both contributed to. And I think our analogy is that it's a lot like physical therapy. And now that's a great middle-aged analogy because, when you get to a certain age, you've probably been in physical therapy at some point. You have an injury or something like that. Younger people may not get this. If you're young and you're not, a high-level athlete, you may not have done this. But if you've been to physical therapy, the idea is that you have, in my case, it was an Achilles tendon, right? You have an Achilles tendon that has gone wonky, it hurts, and you have to stretch it in certain ways. And you have to, and the two things about it is, one is that you have to do something that is painful to do, something that you don't want to do because it actually hurts, right? But you have to repair this, so you have to do something even though you're inclined not to. So if you find the need to, the question of why you would need to change your sense of life, if you find that your life is not going right, and maybe you find you can actually reason out, I'm having an inappropriate reaction to something. I mean, this is what psychotherapy and psychiatry is, that's why you would go into psychotherapy. I'm having a maladaptive reaction to something. I'm reacting to something in the wrong way. I need to change the way I'm doing it. But when you first have to change something in your sense of life, you experience as unnatural, as painful, as difficult to do. And you have to go out and do it anyway, and do it a little bit at a time to the extent you can. The second thing is it requires a lot of repetition. And, if you've been in physical therapy, there's no substitute for simply doing the exercises, doing them over and over again, day after day, over a long period of time. There's no end run around that. It is the repetition and the persistence in the repetition that makes the difference. And I think that's a good example for, like I said, Sherry used the analogy of, if the sense of life is sediment that's built up, you have to lay down new layers of sediment. You have to have new experiences. But I think that the big thing is, Ayn Rand talks a lot in here about the need for having, using explicit ideas and explicit philosophy, and using that to direct your sense of life. She does not talk a lot about the mechanism by which you do that. Now, she does say it's not as simple as, there's a phrase that I can't quite remember, but she says, it's not simply that you can just command it directly. You can't command your sense of life directly. And that's the important thing to remember. The sense of life is not built from the top down, determined from the top down. It's built up from the bottom up. So you build it up by having a series of new experiences and new emotional associations with them that build up those layers of sediment, that rebuild the emotional reactions to the point where you do build it from the ground up. And there's no substitute in that for this issue of simply repetition over time, repetition and persistence in having these new experiences. And they have to be, genuine experiences, genuine emotions. You can't make yourself feel something. You have to seek out experiences that will make you feel a certain way or produce a certain result psychologically. Now, there might be somebody here with more expertise on this, but I understand that the sort of, the old-fashioned version of this was psychotherapy, where you sit and you talk things out, the talking cure, they called it. And the idea was, so the idea is, and you see this dramatized in the movies occasionally, where somebody's talking out, and they have this epiphany. They realize some childhood experience that shaped them, and they have this epiphany, and then everything changes. And I don't think it's that simple as simply identifying, oh, this is how I formed my sense of life. Now that I understand how it happened, it will just change. You also, the more recent thing is, there's a field called cognitive behavioral therapy, which has sort of taken over and become, I think, is now quickly becoming the sort of mainstream in psychiatry. And I think it has a lot of good insights on this, where they will, the example I saw was somebody talking about a person who has a fear of elevators, right? They have a phobia they're deathly afraid of going in an elevator, and talking about this process of training them, little baby step by baby step of, okay, just go up and push the button on the elevator, right? And then if you keep having this experience and disaster does not strike, nothing horrible happens, you can retrain your emotional reaction to the idea that, well, actually, going in an elevator and going up 2 floors is not going to kill me. You can actually get that, that through repetition of the experience, get that to become established in your subconscious. So there may be somebody who knows more about this, but this is the same sort of, psychological therapy as being similar to physical therapy in that sense of just simply repetition of the experience that changes the way the muscle works or changes the way that the subconscious works.
Oh, Sri-
Marisa, you had something more to say about this? Or
Maybe.
you had a
I was
question?
sorry.
Oh,
I
you
was.
had a
I was.
question.
No, I was a little hesitant to go right after that. To be honest with
Okay.
you, I was gonna go.
Let me go ahead and add one more point here. I think one other thing that you can do is change of context, because what happens is that with your sense of life, you actually make a bunch of choices, including the people that you choose to spend time with. And typically you would choose people who actually reinforce those sense of life. And you're kind of caught, and that's a very big feedback loop that'll actually keep you there because it's actually all of you are kind of like supporting each other's sense of life. And if you decide that you want to make a change, many times you have to change that, take yourself out or add something. So I think I think the social component is also very important.
Ayn Rand actually says that. She actually says that she can look at somebody's work of literature and tell you quite a bit of a person. She does say something. It's very similar to what Rob was saying in when she's interviewed. And I was fascinated. So I've listened to countless hours of her interviews. She actually tells people that it's vital for the process of consciously grasping one's sense of life. And because she says we need to find that integration, and just you have a sense of life whether you're conscious of it or not, right? But if you don't put any work into it, it's gonna be whatever it is. And she accents that it's vital that we actively go and seek other go seek experience. I like the word, she didn't use experience, but I'm stealing experience from Rob because I think that's a better way of saying it than she does. And I really like that. Go out and seek the new experience, different experiences, because it's only by viewing the different experiences that you can get that reaction that I think either, I don't remember if it was Sherry or Rob, but how they were saying that it's the, it was Shrikant. When we view a work of art, we're looking at, and we're going, this is what life should be, or ooh, this is not what life should be. But to have that reaction is what will spur us towards action and down the path that more closely aligns with our sense of life. And I have heard several times Ayn Rand says, you have to go seek. She doesn't say experience, but I'm using it. You have to go seek the experience. So I really like the concept, because what I'm hearing her telling me is keep learning, keep seeing new things, trying new things, and getting out of your comfort zone, because that's the best way to grow. And that's just my word, is in my mind, the best way to find harmony with my personal philosophy, my personal values, is to keep growing and learning.
Excellent. So anybody else has questions? So Rob, Sherry, or Marisa? Marisa, you get the first pick. Do you have any questions for the panel?
I have to pick.
No, it's fine. No, it's fine. You can go.
I'm going to pass for right now.
Okay.
I have to.
Rob or Sherry, any questions?
I don't have a question, but I wanted to mention another side part here, that because the sense of life is so set, so much of the groundwork, the foundation is set when we're such young children, pre-conceptual, that to me, and well, to us, that is probably the most important part of parenting that most people are completely, utterly unaware of. It's to make sure that, I mean, you can't force somebody to have a good sense of life, but you can guide it. You can, when you see a child reacting to something in a way that, if that were becoming a pattern, wouldn't be a good pattern, you can always ask an interesting, puzzling question at that moment that they're, maybe they're really gloomy about something and you could see this becoming a pattern. You can always just say a pointed question like, well, why is it gloomy? Is it really as bad as you're thinking? And get the child to focus on the bigger context and see it in a different way. You can keep them from settling into a negative bit of sand in that bottom of the bedrock. You can have a lot to do there. You can do an awful lot by just keeping them away from popular culture. Really.
And the thing is that we've been very carefully sort of choosing and steering them towards different kinds of books and movies. Movies are big now. And so, the choosing, like, okay, we have movie night. Well, what movies do we pick? And, part of the criterion is what sorts of things do we want having an impact on the sense of life of our kids?
Since Rob and Sherry opened the door, I want to jump in here on the question of a sense of life and our culture. And I think it was Leonard Peikoff who talked about, or maybe it's Ayn Rand, I forget which one of them. They actually use a phrase, a very specific phrase where they talk about cultural value deprivation.
That's Ayn Rand, yeah.
Yeah, it's her. Oh, I think you're right. It's an article from her. And she uses a phenomenal analogy about how we are in our culture is increasingly deprived of enough of these experiences that will, provide that lens for our sense of life. And she uses the analogy of it's like asphyxiating on carbon monoxide poisoning. You don't know it's there. You can't smell it, and but it's taking away your oxygen steadily and slowly, and the next thing, before you know it, you're just dead. And I find that to be like super fantastic analogy for the state of culture in general for many different cultures, and would love to hear your takes on it.
Well, I think we're going to get to a little bit more of that in chapter 7, which is the aesthetic vacuum of our age.
Right. Yeah, okay. I might be jumping. You're right.
Oh, no.
Well, my idea is, I think the one that's going to be more relevant, I'm just mentioning, we can talk about it now too, but the one that might be more relevant is chapter 8, which is bootleg romanticism. Because, I think let's put it this way, there's a lot of opportunities for a heroic sense of life as long as it's comic book superheroes, right?
Right now, yeah.
So long as it's not realistic. And that's kind of I think that's a huge thing right now. Right now, it's really easy to find heroes as long as they're not real, as long as they are very deliberately, conspicuously unrealistic. And I think that's something that she writes about a little bit in bootleg, similar to what she writes about bootleg romanticism. But the good news, I think, is that when I think about what is our culture is huge, and it's bigger now than it has ever been, because, again, being of the age where I've had physical therapy, I can remember all the way back. Yes, I can remember all the way back in the ancient mists of time, where if you wanted to watch television, you would ask, "What's on?"
Because there were 3 channels.
Yeah, well, if you had PBS, maybe it was 4, right? So, but you turn on and there are 4 channels to flip through, and whatever was on at this particular moment in time those were the options that you had, right? So there was a lot, if everybody was going off on some crazy trend, that's what you got on every single channel. And today, the things that are out there are just amazing. The variety of things. There's no part of the culture, past or present, and no weird subculture off somewhere, no lost work from the past that is not accessible somewhere. And that's, I think, the huge advantage that you have today, is that there is, we can raise our kids on books that are not the ones that are all the popular ones right now. We can seek out old movies. There's so much more that you could do in terms of the values present in the culture have been greatly increased simply by the internet and the availability of these things, instantly.
I just want to make one point and then we'll open it up for questions. One of the easiest ways to see this concept of sense of life is to look at it across cultures. So you can see like Indians have a certain sense of life, or different parts of India have a certain, French have a different sense of life, Italians have a very different, Germans are very different. And these are all not explicit. These are all just the way people are, and people who spend all their life living like that. And anybody else can see that. Oh, that's very French. That's very Italian. Okay, so you can see that. Rob, you had a point.
Yeah, my favorite example on this is I had a conversation once with a Polish nanny who was taking care of Sherry's niece, and despite my last name, I am not really from Poland, so I don't reflect any kind of Polish culture. But she was just come over from Poland, and we had this interesting discussion. She talked about how disconcerting it was for her that when you ask them, come up to American and ask them how they're doing, what's your response you get? Oh, I'm great. It's terrific. Great day. It's like they all deliriously happy all the time and smiling. And the thing is that it's not actually true that that life is always great and people are always smiling all the time, but it's what you're kind of expected to say in American culture, right? You're expected to be upbeat and happy and optimistic. And that expectation is part of the sense of life, that you're expected to think that life could be great, life should be great. So therefore, that's what's normal.
She talked about how exhausting it was.
Yeah, which is, at first you feel like a loser all the time, right? Because everybody else is happy. Oh, how come you're not as deliriously happy as they are? But then she says, in Poland, because how are you doing? You get, my back hurts, and then you end with this. Gesture, you're drawing, cut my throat now, everything's terrible. And again, it's not the case that everybody in Poland is constantly on the verge of suicide, right? You don't actually feel that bad, but that's the way you're expected to talk about it. And that gives you an idea of what the sense of life, that's a very big sort of wide gap, but I think it's a great illustration of this. And then it ties into talking about the French. My favorite thing about the French is, I would discover this phrase when you ask "ça va," which is basically "how is it going?" One of the answers you can give is "ça peut alors," which means it could go.
A little better.
Could go.
Which is this great sort of,
It may not.
it's this very French kind of sense of ennui, it's very ambivalent.
Wonderful. So now I'm going to open it up for questions. So it's going to be Jyoti, Jonathan, JK, Ash, Vanessa, and Rupali next. Folks, we have 4 rules. Type exclamation mark in chat or raise your hand in Zoom in order to ask questions. Number 2, keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. Number 4, speak your mind. Feel free to disagree with anything anybody says and do so courteously. And let's try to keep it short so we can cover as much as possible. All right, Jyoti, go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to piggyback on what Rob said, but I'm not going to use the exact words, but this is what you were saying. What your view of life is, you create your view of life, and that becomes a world for you, and that is your sense of life. Now, I was called an emotional fool by my own husband because in his mind, I lived in the life in a world of imagination, in fantasy, because I had brought some values from India, which did not exist here to a certain extent. They did not exist here, but I went on with them, even with the negative stimulus, with the demography that I lived in, which did not entertain my values, and I was portrayed as a weak person, but whatever. So it did become my world. Oh, behold, it did become my world. Because that's what I was saying, your demography can sometimes make your destiny. I moved away from that democracy. Demography, changed the location. Here I came in contact with people who actually reciprocated what I had in me all along, which was my world. Now it has become my world. Before it was in my imagination, but now it is my world. So I really do think that you have to have some basis, some foundation for what you
Thank you, Jyoti. I think your video has frozen. Anybody wants to respond to it?
think
Rob?
is your view about the sense of life. Rob?
I think it's great. That's a great way of describing it. You know, I think that the thing is you don't just live in the world. Now, I think say how you live in the world or your sense of life is that your sense of life is formed by what you want to focus on and regard as important versus what you want to not focus on. And then what happens is once the sense of life is formed, it influences you to continue focusing on some things and not on others. And so your experience of life is changed by your selective focus. But then the other important thing that I didn't mention earlier is that when you have that attitude towards life, that approach to life, it also makes you more likely to take actions that are going to reflect and bring about the actual circumstances in your life that will reflect what you thought was possible or desirable. So if you think everything's negative, you're likely to, push away positive things. If you think positive, if you're the typical American who says, "Oh, everything's great," you're more likely to seek after things that are going to be pleasant and exciting and interesting, and positive for you. So the more positive attitude can lead in action, or can motivate you and help motivate you to sustain you to take the actions that will lead to more positive results.
To give a dramatic example of that would be Ayn Rand herself, or her book We the Living, where the contrast. When take We the Living, you have the contrast of the Russian sense of life, which is really very dark. Things are bad and then you die kind of a approach. And then you have these individuals in the middle of that saying, no, I want to live. And that's the theme of We the Living. And what does it take to maintain that sense of life in the middle of that kind of a culture? What do you do? It could be just glimpses of little movies from America, some books, something like that. And then relentless action, finding other people who feel the same way, and then relentless action to get out. So the next one is going to be, Jonathan W., J.K., Ash, Vanessa, Rupali, and Lloyd. Jonathan.
Thank you, Shrikant. Guys, I enjoyed the panel discussion again. I did read the essay, so I've got a question. She was talking about, and you guys mentioned this, it's hard to isolate sense of life since it's something it's in every thought, it's in our actions, mannerisms, whatever. I was wondering, do you make a distinction between, or is there a distinction between sense of life and, say, character and personality and temperament? I'm not sure where they fit in, so I wonder if you guys have some comments on that.
I think that your character is a reflection of your sense of life. And this is an interesting sidebar. As an architect, I work with people, individual clients. I'm usually doing residential work. And I use my ability to tease out someone's sense of life to help me find the right things to do for them. So a good friend of ours asked me to work on his condo apartment, and he had always complained, it was in Chicago, he'd always complained about how he for years, he referred to November as the anti-life month.
November in Chicago is basically 40 degrees and raining all the time.
Gray, rainy. And so he coined it the anti-life month. And so that, and he's a friend of ours. So it's somebody you really know when you're working with them. You have a better way of, you have a deeper connection to their sense of life. You know more about them. You can work on the design more for them. So what I ended up doing was I changed all of the colors inside his apartment so that
It is
even
impossible.
it's impossible to feel that kind of gray blasé.
Yeah, it is impossible for the interior of his apartment to be gray and cold.
So when the November light would come in, it would react with the colors in his apartment, and the whole place would be like this beautiful, crisp fall afternoon. And the best response I got was when he called that one first November and complaining that he couldn't leave. He had no food in his refrigerator and was going to starve, jokingly saying this, because he couldn't leave his apartment. Because the rest of the world was the anti-life month, but it wasn't that way in his apartment. So he may be feeling differently now that he's been stuck there for a while. But anyway, I think it's really, it's that personality reflects it. I mean, you all know, many of you have been on Shrikant's meetups here for quite a while. He always has these raised eyebrows and this twinkle in his eyes and this slight, there it goes, that smile. That's his sense of, Rob's laughing at me. Yeah. That is his sense of life. It comes out all the time. It's just constantly part of his character.
Now, if I want to say that I thought it's a really interesting character, a question asked about character, sense of life, personality, and what was
temperament?
Temperament, yeah. So I think that this is sort of like a family of concepts that are all very similar and related, cool, but have small differences. The one I will just say, I haven't thought about character. I think character focuses more on like the interaction between your sense of life and your moral choices. You know, that's not so much about your artistic choices or your personal style or manner, but more about, you know, how do you approach the big moral issues in your life, which is a subset of sense of life. Temperament, I think, you know, we talked about that with you know, babies have a temperament. I think temperament is this very, very simple base, you know, on which everything else is built. That's more like almost like an attitude or a standard reaction to things that is not, but it has very little content to it. You know, it's very non-specific. I think I'm trying to do a better way to explain that some other time. But and the personality, and interesting between sense of life and personality would be an interesting question. And I think it's a great question. I'm not sure I have the answers to it.
So thank you. Next up is JK, Ash, and Vanessa. JK.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, this discussion about the sense of life, and that it's hard to pin down exactly what it is, but it seems like, you know, it's, you say it's vague. So the question is, does the artist imitate the sense of life, or does the sense of life, you know, imitate art? And, you know, the art actually, you know, as we know, it expresses the sense of life, and also what is an obstruction or opposed to the sense of life. The great artist, you know, has these very complicated, you know, art that they use to express those very complicated feelings about life. And of course, it includes a sense of life, but also includes all those other negativities, like the famous painting by Picasso, you know, Guernica, right, where it shows how destructive war is, you know, and there's a certain beauty in that, and expresses a sense of life. But it's also very opposed to, you know, what a real sense of life should be. So there's kind of a morality there, and you know, it seems like the sense of life has to be connected with a certain morality that you just mentioned.
Sure. Let us address that. Go ahead. Anybody? What is the connection between the artist's sense of life and his creations?
Well, I'm going to say react to one thing, which is you described sense of life as being vague, and I think vague is the wrong word. I think the word is that it is complex and diffuse. By complex meaning it's a combination of a whole bunch of different elements, and it's diffuse in the sense that it's spread out over a whole lot of different interactions, things the person says, different interactions he has with the world. And the work of an artist, I think specifically like thinking of a literary artist or a screenwriter or something like that, the work of an artist is to search out for those things that are especially revealing, those the words a person will say, a phrase that they'll use, a mannerism he has that is particularly expressive, or it's like so it's something that's complex and diffuse, but there are little nodes. Like, this person always reacts in a certain way to something happening. Let's take that little thing that contains a lot of implications in it. Let's put that front and center. Or let's pick out a situation that puts someone in a situation where their reaction to this situation is going to be extremely revealing. In one way or the other, it's going to show something about them. And these are things which in normal life, can take a long time to happen. You can interact with someone for weeks and months, and then suddenly have a moment where he responds to something. You say, oh, and now I get why this person's reacting, who this person is. You finally got to know something about them because you had to wait around for something to happen that sort of crystallized it all. And the job of the artist is to say, well, let's cut out those weeks and months. Let's do a scene in which you have the person react in a certain way to something.
Excellent. I want to add one more thing, that the sense of life of the artist actually permeates their entire work.
Absolutely.
Because what it does is that, creating art involves making numerous decisions of all kinds. And it is your subconscious, it is your automatized reactions that are shaping many of these decisions. Because as you create these kinds, a work of art, the artist is first reacting to that of its own creation. And they're using that feedback loop between what they're creating and their sense of life to shape the work of art. So that's how the sense of life of the artist gets infused in the work of art. So many times, you can look at somebody's like visual arts, you can look at something and say, oh, that's Caravaggio. Oh, that's Leonardo. It's like, if you know, or music, you can hear this little snippet and say, oh, that's Mozart. Because what you're seeing there is their sense of life fully expressed in that little fragment.
And there's a whole bunch of parts that make that up. It's things like big obvious things like subject matter and composition, but it gets down to fine little details like color choices, if it's a painting, say, and what colors are paired with other colors, whether lines are sharp or softly faded. All of those things are reflections. Those are that artist's sense of life being shown on paper. The choices that an artist cannot consciously go through every single step, or you'd never ever finish anything. But it comes out almost without the tiniest details. It's all reflecting it's all reflecting some element of that artist's sense of life.
Excellent. Next up is Ash, Vanessa, Rupali, Lloyd, Laura, Les, Jonathan, and JK. Ash, go ahead.
Yeah, so similar to Jonathan's question on the relationship of sense of life and temperament and so on, this might be a bit more tangential to a discussion of philosophy and sense of life. And I don't think Ayn Rand took a position on this issue as far as I know, but it'd be interesting to get the panelists' take, because I think these kinds of borderline cases can kind of clarify a concept and its limits. So if sense of life is a pre-conceptual emotional summation of an individual's experience of life, do you think animals have a sense of life or some more primitive equivalent? Because they're, animals are mostly non-conceptual, but at least other mammals clearly have emotional mechanisms. So is there some kind of spectrum here that sense of life exists on? Obviously, animals don't respond to art in the way that we do, but some of them do seem to have that sort of immediate reaction to some people and other animals, and vice versa. We can have that kind of response to pets. It's probably more based on perceptual level association, but there might still be some deeper emotional integration underlying those responses. So does that make sense? Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
I would say that animals have a temperament.
Yeah.
I don't think it goes any beyond that, but they most definitely have a temperament. And
right outside the door right now is a very bonkers dog who's very, very excitable, extremely friendly, but also friendly in the sense that you would be injured by the friendliness if you're not careful.
But no, we've had, I don't even know how many pets we've had. Every single one of them has their distinct personality. Some are fearful of everything. Some are shy. Some are gregarious. Some are just plain trouble. And every mischievous, every single one of them, they have some kind of a base element temperament. I don't know that it would go, I don't know that it goes so far as sense of life.
What's interesting, what's revealing is that you can actually breed for temperament too.
Yeah, you can.
That different breeds have different temperaments based on what's desirable for that, usually for what original, work the dog did. So, there's, I think there is this very sort of very crude base level temperament that can be, that is inherited. And it's inherited in animals and inherited to a certain extent in humans. I think in humans, it's inherited to a lesser extent because humans are integrating machines. Mm-hmm. We are self-programming machines. Our brains are made to be self-programmed. So I think fewer things are programmed in by genetics in human beings than in other animals, because that's the nature, our brain was evolved basically to be self-programmable in a way that a dog's brain is not evolved to be self-programmable. So, but I think there is still that, that the thing we share with the animals is that very crude, simple underlying temperament that gives a very crude level of base reactions to things that then get shaped by all the self-programming that we do on top of it.
Next on the topic of, it's just really quick, just want to say on the topic of art, Ayn Rand does specify that she separates out humans, beings, man from animal, in that we are a conceptual being, and she does not believe that there exists any animal that uses art as an expression. I don't know if that still holds true today, but that's something that she definitely believed and she stated explicitly.
Next up is Vanessa, Rupali, and Lloyd. Vanessa?
Okay, well, I want to slightly disagree with what Rob said about Americans being chipper. I just think of the one question, how about them Yankees? When it comes to sporting, if they just saw a sporting event, they may not be so cheerful. But this may be initially directed towards Maritza. Full disclaimer here, I'm a Western European mutt, so I really don't have a culture per se, but if you think of like nature enthusiasts, I will see amazement at looking at the dew on the spider's web, or if you see like a flower growing from a tree, or even like in December, if you have one of those days where it's a crystal blue sky or that milky sky where you can't see the clouds, but you've got that, opaque backdrop. Sometimes it's amazing looking at like a tree, like a oak or a maple, how you can see the individual branches, the beauty and the patterns and the structure. So it's almost like Mother Nature's the artist here. Just like I said, that you can find, or even how I've been mesmerized watching a drop of rain as it traverses down the window pane, and just not seeing where it's going to take. And sometimes if you can still see the trail it took before it dries away or another raindrop comes down. Is that kind of this thing about the purpose of life or the sense of life, or am I out in left field like always?
I think it could be. Art is in the eye of the beholder, and it's a very personal experience. So if for you, that is something that you view as artistic, I believe that perhaps subjectively it could be. I will say that's not exactly the vein in which I think Ayn Rand was thinking. But again, because it is a personal to each person, I wouldn't want to say that it's absolutely not.
I would say that what you're reflecting is that's your sense of life reacting to the world around you. And I'm smiling here as you're describing it because I'm right there with you. I take pictures of the frost on my windshield before I thaw it in the morning because of how beautiful they look coming down the windshield. This is your reaction to the world around you, and you see it in a way that it's full of beauty and interest and excitement. There are people who will look at those same things and take a totally different view. I mean, I know people who can't handle any rain because it just feels so gloomy to them. Personally, I think rain is beautiful, and big storms rolling in are exciting. So those are reflections of your sense of life to the world around you.
So what I would add is that, sense of life is, pre-conceptual equivalent of philosophy. So in philosophy, there is a view you have of the world, and then you have a view of yourself or of human beings. This, your reaction to nature reflects your view of the world. What kind of a world is it? Is it an interesting world? Is it a threatening world? Is it a world where you would like to live? What is your response to the world itself? And that's what is being captured here. Next up is Rupali.
Thank you again. Sherry, I had the same response that you had when I first met Shrikant almost 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So I completely agree with you on that. Now, Shrikant, I'm going to go back to your question about what is involved in change in sense of life, right? And one thing that I've noticed with students, especially the middle school students that we work with, they come to our school perhaps anxious or not able to fit in, but with constant action and reflection, something that Rob mentioned about psychotherapy, right? So talking about their emotions and their reactions, and then actually giving them an actionable item, a real purposeful project that they can participate in, and then reflect again on how they feel. So thus building their confidence. And it's a cycle that you have an action, reflect, repeat, and then, learn to regulate behavior, learn to regulate emotions. And that process, I think, is helpful. And we've seen sometimes within just a few weeks that children go from being negative to being a positive influence. And sometimes it takes longer, but it certainly is not an overnight process. And that brings me to a question is how can children then continue to have this become part of their of themselves, so that even after they leave school they can continue that process irrespective of which environment they go in. And I think environment is a huge part of developing your sense of life too. So I'll leave with that. Thank you.
I've got one quick thing to add on this because we have a middle school boy, and the thing about middle school boys is that they are much more reticent than middle school girls to talk about their emotions or talk about anything emotional. And not only a middle school boy, but he's like half Norwegian, so that adds a whole extra level of reserve on top of that. But that's where you talk about actionable items. I think the 13-year-old boy is much more interested in something he can do that will have an impact rather than in talking about it and opening up. And they tend to be naturally reserved. And so I think that idea of it's not just a matter of sitting around and talking about your feelings because you're going to resist that. It's also the things you can do and the various things that they have to do at school with their friends. Men are notorious. Men and boys are notorious for the idea that like going out and playing a game in sports is the way to work out a whole bunch of emotional stuff that doesn't seem like it's involved in a game in sports at all, but there it is, right? And so I think that now how do you continue that? I think, I think the crucial thing that I would take away from this, especially for this chapter of Romantic Manifesto, which he's talking about, the need to guide your life, guide your sense of life, and build your sense of life, and not just have it be pushed around by random things in your environment. The most important habit you can instill in someone is the habit of being introspective.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to
That's what I was going to say.
Okay, you then say it.
Well, I was going to say, but you're teaching them by example, is you're showing them how to reflect upon themselves, to introspect. And that's such a powerful tool that once you get someone used to using that tool, there is such a positive feedback loop that comes from using it, that you've essentially put it in their tool belt and they will carry it with them the rest of their lives.
And I think those of us who are introspective and develop those skills kind of take it for granted, but I'm amazed sometimes at how bad people are at simple questions like, what am I feeling and why?
Mm-hmm.
Because, if you haven't learned that, it's a mystery. You just feel it and you don't know why.
I would like to add one thing, and this is actually a hallmark of the Montessori system. Like in other places, there can be a teacher who is an inspiring teacher who can influence the sense of life of the kids that they're working with for a period of time. Montessori system has one additional thing over that, because the entire system is made for independent action. So the teacher is just making things available, and the child is actually doing things on their own. So if they get that sense of life built into them doing things, then that is far more scalable, far more transferable to other contexts. You're basically building an independent being, and you are helping create better sense of life in them at that level. That transports much better than even a brilliant teacher, because now it is in them. Next up is going to be Lloyd, Laura, and Les. Lloyd.
Yeah, I just wanted to wonder about, maybe get your reaction to, I do believe that from great suffering comes great art. And, somebody mentioned Picasso before. And Picasso, who I think overall had a very positive sense of life, I think in his youth, a friend of his committed suicide, and he started his blue period, if you're aware of that. And the paintings are very sad, old man playing guitar, woman in the street, but they're really striking. I mean, I have not forgotten seeing that blue period and those blue paintings of Picasso. So, there's a lot of negative emotion there, bad things, but if he had choked it off and was micromanaging his sense of life, well, I won't go there because that's negative, we would have been deprived of a lot of great art, from that suffering of losing his friend. I mean, I just refer you to his blue period. They're very striking. They're not upbeat, but they are very striking. So I just wanted to get your thought of the suffering creating great art kind of situation.
So I just would like to say, I don't think that there is any art that should be excluded from the statement that, art is the emotion of one's sense of life. I don't believe that that's what Ayn Rand is saying. She's saying that the romantic art is in her mind, that's what's upholding those principles that most align with her sense of life. And, that's what she believes to be the more, the forward path. But, I would agree with you that there's so much art. Like, think of Romeo and Juliet. To me, that's a great play, right? I've seen it in a couple different theaters. It's striking, and it when you read a news article about somebody committing suicide, it's sad. We don't like to see it. But when you see this crescendo of young, good people just like committing suicide in this Romeo and Juliet, You feel it on a level that you don't feel it when you're reading a news article. That's what art is doing for you. It's bringing that emotion to life. And from a perspective of Romeo and Juliet, that's a deterministic worldview. Now, that resonates within me as I reject this worldview. But even as I viscerally reject that worldview, I can still be like in awe and transported and emotionally moved by this work of art. I'm hoping that that's kind of gives you an idea of what I think is how Ayn Rand is seeing art. And that's what she's telling us when she says that it's so vital. And I believe that she says it's vital regardless of whether or not it's it includes your perspective, because it allows you to say, this is not life as I view it.
I just want to add one very quickly thing to that. It says, I don't know how much Lloyd knows about Ayn Rand's work, but her first novel, We the Living, is basically her taking the pain and tragedy of her experience in under Soviet totalitarianism. And it's not a novel with a really particularly happy ending. So it's taking the pain and tragedy of Soviet totalitarianism and turning that into art. But the difference, I would say, is that the thing that she adds to it from her sense of life is that she's not just showing you, here's the horrors of Soviet totalitarianism. She's showing it to you from the perspective of the spirit of someone who has the ability to resist that and to strive for the opposite of that. So she's finding the positive aspect within the negative, and that's her sense of life. And she mentions, I think Dostoevsky was it? No, or it's, I think it's Dostoevsky she mentions as being, taking me through a chamber of horrors, but with an expert guide. And her difference between her and Dostoevsky is she'll show you she'll show you all the horrible stuff, but then she'll also show you somebody who's good, who's showing you the opposite of that within that context. So that's where the difference between her sense of life and Dostoevsky's approach. So, there's certainly not a rule that, it's bad to ever show art about something that's good, something that's bad or painful.
I would say it's part of being a human, that there's tragedy, there's suffering, there's joy, there's all of those emotions. Art would be mono stereo again if we only had art of one type. I think some of the most moving pieces of art I've seen do come from tragic situations. Some of my favorite pieces, in fact, generally, and even Picasso, he was the one who survived a close friend who had committed suicide. So he chose not to. So that's reflected partially. There is a deep sadness in the blue period, but there's also the fact that he is painting. He's not, following suit.
I'll just say one thing. Romanticism, the heart of it is the will, the power of will, and many times the suffering is the foil. So Dostoevsky is a clear example, or other period you can look at, Greek tragedies like Antigone. It is going through suffering, but it is focused on the will of what what a human being can do in spite of any situation. So it dramatizes the will aspect. Next up is Laura, Les, Jonathan, and JK, and then we'll go to breakout rooms. Laura, what's your question?
I think it's no longer a question. I'm a little bit overwhelmed by all of this. I think somebody should take me on as a research project, and I'd like to go through all this with them and try and help me to make sense of things. I think it's pretty amazing listening to all of this over the last couple of days. I'm more confused than I've ever been, so I could use some help.
Wonderful.
I kind of get the aspects, but I, as a painter, don't go through all that kind of stuff that everybody talks about. The emotional aspects and the presenting of myself and So I'd like to talk more to some of you all.
Yeah,
Perhaps.
what I would recommend, Laura, is if you can, you can read or listen to Romantic Manifesto. That would be a good place to start, and we can go from there. Next up is Les. Les, are you there? You had unmuted a moment ago, so it's going to be Les, Jonathan, and JK. So Jonathan.
Am I muted now?
Yes, now you're on. Go ahead.
Okay, it's Les. Yeah. Okay, sorry about that, Shriek. I have a question for Sherry and Robert, and I think it builds on what Sherry was talking about, how to change someone's sense of life, encourage it at a young age. And also, I'm looking at somebody at more middle age. And one of the big things that Ayn Rand mentions in this chapter and in the previous one was that mysticism can really interfere with the process of reconciling a sense of life with a rationally integrated philosophy. And when you see someone that you respect in middle age that is kind of steeped in this mysticism, do you try to encourage introspection? Do you try to set example? What else can you do to try to help them with the change to a better sense of life and a philosophy? Without giving them maybe a book by Ayn Rand.
Yeah.
That's right.
I think it ties into what Shrikant was talking about earlier about it helps to have the surrounding change. So if this is a friend of yours, you're trying to encourage spending less time with people that encourage the mysticism and more time in another realm, that could be a way. Pointed questions, I find, very gently pointed questions. Like, for example, I'm going to say this and then probably regret because my mother may watch this. She's a worry, we call her a worry wart. And one of the things that I have done over the years, and whenever she starts one of these spirals of worry about everything, I'll start firing off gentle little questions to kind of stop that thinking process. And I've been doing this most of my adult life. But I've also just been living my life. So she sees me as an example. And at some point, she just called me up out of the blue and said, I used to do this all the time and I don't anymore. And I thank you for that. So you don't know what part's going to change it, but you can ask, sometimes I do this with clients. I try to do some level of introspection. I see clients who are responding to a certain thing one way or another. And it's dangerous to try to take somebody's reaction to one thing and take that as a definitive comment on who they are or what their sense of life is, because every one of those little aggregate experiences adds up. So you can't just take one thing out of context and go with it. But what you can do is you can kind of feel around, you can kind of watch and see for patterns, and you can kind of you can point those questions at the heart of the pattern, and that may be a faster way to kind of stop that thinking spiral.
Yeah, but I got to remind everybody of the old joke: how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is one, but the light bulb has to really want to change. So it's hard enough to change your own sense of life. It's difficult to have a lot of impact on somebody else unless they are open to open to that change, or you can find some very indirect and gentle way to do it.
Sherry, I think you're going to hear from your mom. Last time we did the meetup on Louis Sullivan. They just got into the car and
Yeah,
they watched the meetup. They got in the car, drove two hours to see his buildings. So
That's
you're
true.
gonna hear from your mom.
I probably will.
Next up is going to be Jonathan, followed by JK. Jonathan.
Thank you again, Shrikant. I'd have heaps more questions, but I'll settle at one more today. So, we're talking about changing sense of life. For me, I find it difficult. So I read this essay and it's like, I can't identify my sense of life. The way it was explained was, I'm just looking at it now and you guys discussed it, was it's an emotion which is part of all his other emotions and underlies all his experiences. This is a sense of life. So my question is, I can't identify it. I can't pinpoint a unity. There's a lot of conflicting elements. So my question is, what would be some suggestions on trying to identify a sense of life?
Well, we're talking about art.
Yeah.
So start, and that's a great place to start, which is, what sorts of art do you like? And then the main thing is not so much what sorts of art do you like, but identifying why, that's because people can, I've been amazed sometimes that people will like something that I think I don't see any value in, but then you ask them why, and there's some aspect of it that appeals to them that's different from what you might have assumed. So that, and I think it goes back to the issue of learning that process of introspection, of, looking at things and saying, what am I feeling and why? And learning how to tease that out and say, okay, I like this movie. I really like this movie. I've watched it 17 times. Why is it? What does I like about this movie? What is it that appeals to me? And trying to figure out what is in there. And that's going to be, and it's going to take time over repetition of a whole bunch of different things, but that's a great place to start.
I would say do that across different fields of art, sculpture, music, movies, paintings. But I would throw in, maybe this feels counterintuitive, but I think it's always a really great way of doing it. Look for the opposite. Try to find the things that really repel you in small doses. Try to use those as an opportunity to introspect, because sometimes it's easier to introspect on the other side. When you see something that really repels you, you can sit for a minute and say, why? And sometimes your subconscious will throw those answers up as a way of getting the hell out of there. You know what I mean? You'll get those bright, crystal clear answers right away of what exactly it is that repels you about a certain thing.
Plus, ask yourself, why do I keep going to Shrikant's meetups?
Yeah.
What's that?
If I could just very quickly add something to that, I would also say, in the things you watch already. So I'm not a very big television watcher. I watch it occasionally. And sometimes I wonder if I'm watching TV wrong, because I'm always trying to find out what is the moral
contract from.
What is the
go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm always trying to find out what's the moral story behind this. Now, I didn't watch some of the American television shows that are so popular until I was much older. Like Star Trek versus Star Wars. The first time I saw Star Wars was maybe 6-7 years ago, and I thought it was terrible. I was like, what? These are underdeveloped characters, and what? And then they're like, oh, you got to watch the second one. It's amazing. It's the best one. And I was like, and then I watched the second one, and I'm like, so I was like, this is wretched. And then the same person recommended to me Star Trek, and I'm like, I don't know why I'm listening to you. And I watched Star Trek, and I'm like, how on earth do they put these in the same sentence? Because to me, what I couldn't find in Star Wars is like, for me personally, again, I'm not making a statement of which one is better. I just want to put that on a base level here. I'm not I don't want to go into that. That's not the point. The point is, what I found was I could not answer my question that I ask of every show I watch. What is the moral issue that's being told in this story? I didn't find that there was sufficient meat in a Star Wars type of show to give it to me. And in Star Trek, I actually was fascinated. I find that every episode is tackling a moral quandary. Again, this is my opinion. I'm not saying this is, art or anything. But if you approach everything that you view, whether it's a poem, even if you do it with a reality television show, ask what am I getting out of this? And if you do that, you'll learn something about yourself almost more than you learn anything about the show, because it gives you something. If it's a personal thing, like if you're reading a friend's poetry, you might learn something about the friend as well. But it's fascinating to do for everything. Like I'm fascinated by trees, just all kinds of trees and everything. And it wasn't until I was in my 20s that I asked myself, what is it about the tree? And it gave me an insight in myself. It wasn't the actual physical tree. It's like what in my mind it represents to me. So that's just a suggestion, a personal suggestion I would make. If you're trying to develop or figure out what might be your sense of life, just question everything. Everything you touch or look at, just find a question that works for you and ask it of every little thing that you look at. Well, even if it's like a news article, just everything. And then as you find the different answers, that will help you to shape some idea of how you view things.
I'm going to add one thing.
Okay, then let me
hand it over to you. So your sense of life is basically your automatized evaluations. Okay, your automatic, what is it that you actually hold subconsciously? That's what you're trying to get at. So I think the best way to do that is through kind of triangulation. Instead of saying, okay, this is one thing that is going, you basically look at all your kind of positive and negative reactions and try to ask simply, why is it that way? And that is going to kind of slowly build up the picture. One other power, and this is regardless of art, people, anything, just reactions, and then just simply asking why. And don't try to kind of expect that like one magic bullet is going to do it, because it's like a think of it visually, like it's like a whole kind of circle, and you're trying to get at it from multiple angles. So that's one thing. The second one, which is actually quite powerful, because you think explicitly. So another way, very simple way, is to see the mismatches between your explicit thinking and your reactions, because that is going to give you a lot of clues about where it might, what the difference is, because you have now two things. It's like the stereo effect. So this is kind of using the stereo that Sherry talked about as, what is it called? It is like a measuring mechanism. So you measure it from two different points and you get the difference.
Triangulation.
Triangulation. So you're using the explicit and the implicit as a triangulation technique. So those are the ideas that I can think of. Sherry.
Yeah, the last thing I would say is, when you do this process, if it hasn't been something you've normally done, just a pre-warning, there gets to be a point probably for most people when that sense of life finally feels like it's being heard. It gets emotional. So just be prepared to be gentle with yourself.
Very good. I just want to get a quick note to Maritza about Star Wars. So the key
no.
Well, because we're in Star Wars Centrals right now. The key to Star Wars is that you're supposed to be 8 years old when you see it first.
There you go.
So
well, that's where I failed. So that's interesting you say that. That's actually fascinating to me. I keep thinking I want to do a topic on this in my other discussion group. I'm fascinated that everyone who tells me, when I tell them I don't get it, the explanation I get is like, well, I saw it for the first time as a child. Exactly. And I saw it for the first time as a 30-year-old.
Right. So you have
in my mid-30s.
So back yourself back into.
That's fascinating. I have to suspend my disbelief.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I was literally 8 years old when Star Wars came out, and I saw it in the theaters. So that's the typical American experience.
I'm with you, Maritza. and as an adult.
One of the, if you're going to have a discussion of Star Trek on any other thing, you have to invite me because
I shall do so because it's on my list. I have a very long list of future topics to write. That one's on there.
You just got to make sure you have the mute button ready for him.
All right. So we're going to take one last question and then we'll go directly to takeaways. We're running a little short of time, so we'll just go do takeaways after that. So last question is from JK. JK, if you could keep it short.
Okay, just two short questions. Why does she use the word romantic for the title of her book? And does it refer to 19th century romanticism or some other? And also this idea of the sense of life, it could be, can we, reference it to Nietzsche's idea of the will to power or Freud's, kind of life force, life's drive, or maybe it's a combination of those.
I'll take the Nietzsche and Freud thing because I've read them. Nietzsche is fun to read. Freud is not. I mean, he's like insane, but he's fun to read. It's a weird thing. He's insane in a colorful and interesting way. So no, it's not the same thing as Nietzsche's will to power. Nietzsche's will to power actually is like this. See, Nietzsche is sometimes seen as an individualist. He actually didn't believe in the existence of the individual. He thinks that you as an individual are just the combination of these brute emotional drives that come from your biology, and they're all struggling. And the actual will to power is one drive or impulse struggling for mastery over all the others. And then having mastered them within yourself, you then try to master everybody else and make yourself ruler of the universe. It's a very weird, twisted thing. That the sense of life is more, your encounter with life and your summation of your reaction to your interactions with the world. So it's very different from the will to power. And Freud, as I recall, is pretty much just a scientific version of Nietzsche, in the sense that the drives and urges that are competing within you come from the unconscious and have something to do with your mother and and your toilet training. And I'm not making that part up. I wish I would.
Oh God.
So it's all given this sort of scientific gloss, but it's the same, very much same idea. And I guess that ties into your other question though, because she chose romantic because it ties into romanticism in the literary and artistic sense in the 19th century. Whereas Nietzsche and Freud are coming more from romanticism in the philosophical sense. And the common between the two, philosophical romantic and artistic romanticism, is an emphasis on very strong emotions. But philosophical romanticism is the idea that strong emotion rules everything and is basically the creator of the whole universe. All the universe is ruled by emotion as a literal philosophic thing. Whereas romanticism in the literary and artistic sense is an interest in things that evoke strong emotions, but doesn't necessarily imply that emotion is all there is. I guess that's my short answer.
And the term romantic is different for philosophy, for literature, for sculpture, for music. They're all a little bit different. They don't completely line up with one another time period wise either, am I?
A little closely aligned.
Closely, but not quite.
Excellent. So it's time for takeaways. What are you walking away with? So I'll start in the order in which I see people. It's going to be Les, Jonathan, Dave, and JK. Les. Okay. Next is Jonathan.
Shriek, it's Les again.
Les, go ahead.
Sorry about that. The Zoom button, I'm a little confused with the mute and the unmute. I thought it'd be opposite the way it presents itself, but just my second time on Zooms. But anyway, I'd just like to, the concept around physical therapy, the relevance and how it really, you can extend that to physical, your spiritual therapy and reconciling your sense of life and with a cognitive philosophy or rationally integrated philosophy that requires work. And I think I get that. I know myself, I had a shoulder injury here that I hurt, and I have to go through that process of retraining the body, determination, persistence, all those things. And actually, there was a quote that when I thought about Robert saying that persistence and determination really pay off in this process of reconciling and changing your sense of life with a conscious philosophy that's rationally integrated. I've got this saying that press on, nothing in the world can take the place of persistence. Talent will not. Nothing is more common than unsuccessful men with talent. Genius will not. Unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. Education alone will not. The world is full of educated derelicts. Persistence and determination alone are omnipotent.
Wonderful.
That was my compliments of Joseph Kossman.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Les.
Yeah. Okay.
Appreciate it. Next up is Jonathan, JK, and Dave.
Thanks, Shrikant. Yes, so for me, I think a bit more I got a bit more clarification around the concept. So distinguishing between character, personality, temperament being a base, character being involving moral actions and being more narrower than sense of life, and then just more questions. So thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Next up is JK, Dave, and Lloyd. JK?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting discussion. Iran's sense of life, I still trying to grapple with how she relates that to her own life, to her life in this country, and her ultra sense of individualism, embracing capitalism, may be a kind of a reaction to her life in the Soviet Union. But it doesn't really. It doesn't really connect with the sense of life connects with the history of philosophy, Western philosophy, world philosophy, and that I still can't understand what she really means by the sense of life.
Okay.
But it's very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, JK. Next up is Dave, Lloyd, and Jyoti. Dave?
Thanks, Shrikant. A great presentation to all. As far as the personality development, it was fascinating to me. I saw an excellent documentary on twin studies of maternal twins separated at birth. It really gets to the nature versus nurture question. And the other thing is, Rob, I'm going to try to find your movie, and I will throw out a recommendation of a small science fiction film, I think from the 1980s, called The Lathe of Heaven. Yes. About living a world from your imagination. Oh, I see you're nodding head, so you had seen it? To me, it was not popular, but it's just fascinating to me. Thank you very much. Great presentation.
Thank you, Dave. Next up is Lloyd, Jyoti, and Rupali. Lloyd?
Yeah, I just wanted to say how I feel like all the panelists really embody an exemplary sense of life. I mean, I really get from you folks your joy for life, your zest for life, your open-mindedness. So I just want to say you yourselves are a very good exemplar of what we're talking about. So thank you.
Thank you, Lloyd. They're all my friends.
Thank you.
Great minds think alike. Good.
Shrikant collects people like this.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up is Jyoti, Rupali, and David Miller.
Okay, Sherry, Rob, and Marissa, thank you. That was a very enlightening lecture because I didn't know anything about what I was getting into. And also I feel validated today. I was not an emotional fool after all. But I like what Shrikant said. Shrikant, when you were responding to Maritza about the automaticity of the philosophy of your life, however, additional experiences can modify your belief system too. So I'm taking a lot with me today. Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Jyoti. Next up is Rupali, David Miller, and Ash.
Hi, Shrikant. Another wonderful afternoon. Thank you, Sherry, Rob, and Maritza. So I want to share, I think Jonathan had mentioned earlier about how to recognize your sense of life. Back in the 80s, there was a Pakistani adaptation of The Fountainhead, which I saw on Indian TV growing up in my middle school years, right? And so when I saw that adaptation and the lead character, and I said, I can relate to that. that's the life that I would like to have. And, you know, at a very young age, you can recognize what you want and what you don't want, what feels right to you and what doesn't. And you look at the world around you and you start questioning and you start thinking, is this what was meant in that story? Or is this the kind of life that character was leading? Or, and you start looking at people around you through that viewpoint. And I think today it just brought me back to that moment, which was so long ago, when it was that aha moment for me. And then, of course, I read Fountainhead and all the other books and just found it to be, you know, continue to lead me to develop my sense of life. So thank you.
Thank you, Rupali. Next up is David, Ash, and Vanessa. David?
Yes, well, regarding sense of life, positive versus negative, just a word of warning that in my view, positive thinking without negative thinking is a death trap. So a serious word of warning. If you push either too far, they're death traps.
Thank you, David. I don't think Ayn Rand focuses on that. Ayn Rand focuses on the will of being able to kind of distinguish between them. So thank you. Next up is Ash, Vanessa, and Joel. Ash.
Yeah, I think my biggest takeaways from the discussion and the reading this week were just kind of sense of life as an extension of what we were talking about last week about psychoepistemology, in the sense that, you know, it's kind of at this interface between philosophy and psychology. And specifically, I think it's fascinating how Ayn Rand talks about these kind of two distinct but related hierarchies of abstraction. First, this emotional hierarchy that culminates in sense of life, and then the, you know, cognitive hierarchy that, you know, ultimately becomes a conscious philosophy, and how these kind of interact in a sort of spiral way. So I think I find that really fascinating.
Wonderful. A great observation, Ash. I really like the, you know, the parallel hierarchy point. Next up is Vanessa, Joel, and Kevin.
A good presentation. Some of these things, whether maybe not clarifying, and now have a name to put to something either I felt or a topic or a concept. And so like I said, it's very helpful, and I enjoyed this. And then want to say also the thing is it's very individual. Like Marissa was saying, she's not into movies. Like some people get their enjoyment from reading books. And for me, some of it was the experience, like an entire experience growing up, like, you know, watching, seeing how someone's going to react. And it's, you can now maybe watch a movie or a rerun and you remember the experience of either something stupid or how someone didn't get something. Then 2 days later, they got what the line meant. So like I said, I enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. And I think one of the values of this book is that it lets you figure out exactly what is going on in your reactions, you know, very deep reactions. Gives you words for the first time about what's going on. Next up is Joel, Kevin, and Tom. Joel. Okay, next up is Kevin.
Thank you, Shank. Good presentation, you guys. I would say it's not only let my life make sense, also let other people, you know, make sense to yourself. At the same time, accept other form of sense of life, whether animal or plant, other like tree. I got a question. Should our life of sense align to our purpose and the meaningful of life? Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Tom, Judith, and Sarika. Tom?
Well, thank you. One thing I got out of this meeting is the idea that people are works of art themselves because man is a being of self-made wealth as well as self-made soul. And so the activities, the choices people make based on their purposes and their value premises should be considered something that they have self-directed toward, and those are based on whatever emotions at the subconscious level that they have. So from that point of view, people are considered works of art, and one should see oneself as works of art as well. So that's a good idea.
Wonderful, wonderful. Next up is Judith, Sarika, and Mike. Judith?
Oh my gosh, I am so so funny to follow up on Tom, because that is what I wanted to say. I just wanted to, because I'm thinking about children too, you know. My children didn't grow up in the best circumstances. I didn't raise them in the best circumstances, but I always tried to impart to them, you know, that each of us has only one life to live, and we can't choose all our circumstances. So we have to be the artists of what we do with that, and how we want to think about it, and how we want to act on it. So that is something I tried to impart on them, in them. And so, and then that also, I do think, like people have said, that, you know, difficulty in life can aid in giving us a different perspective. It's just like when you move to a different land, you have a different perspective. When you live outside of your immediate society, it gives you an insight that is an advantage that people within may not have. So those are advantages as well as disadvantages sometimes. And then I want to say that I just love this discussion so much. I have not read the Romantic Manifesto, but I want to now. I read The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged years and years ago, and they impacted me a lot at the time. But over the years, I've often thought, would I really like those anymore? I'm not too sure. So it's interesting to hear how you all like it. It makes me feel like I should revisit it maybe. Finally, last thing, nature, stories, music, all that kind of art has been like such an important part of my life. And what this particular discussion made me think about for the first time was like the explicit part of that. Like, how does that translate? You know, like, how do they go together? I hadn't really thought about that. So that is why I now want to read that Romantic Manifesto and all those essays you talked about. So thank you very much, everybody.
Wonderful. Judith, that was just excellent. So thank you so much for that. We're all delighted that, see, firstly, I can talk to Rob and Sherry for hours and hours, and I do talk to them for hours and hours. So this is just a, tremendous treat for me. And I'm delighted that so many people are getting so much value from that. Next up is Sarika, Mike, and Steph. Sarika.
Okay, so I did learn a lot. I learned that one thing was that our sense of life can be shown by how we react to people, and that in order to change and redirect our sense of life, there's the explicit philosophy, but then there's also the implicit philosophy of life. And in order to change that, the speakers were saying that, to seek changes in environment, to seek new experiences, and to actively try and have these experiences cultivate different emotions so that we can move through that inner rubble and recreate how we feel about situations. And then hopefully that would transform the implicit and explicit, and that it requires repetition and persistence to constantly reach for a positive spin or perspective, even and especially when there are other negative forces. So just trying hard.
Thank you, Sarika. Next up is Mike, followed by Steph. Mike, are you there? Okay. Go ahead, Mike.
I'm here. Couple things that I got out of this, short briefly, is what you see depends on your point of view. And that was true in Star Trek, and it's true in What Dreams May Come. And now we're also wired to value negative thinking more than positive thinking, and our culture and learning is to overcome that problem. If you got a 20% loss, most people don't think it's as bad as bad as a 20% gain. But think about it that 100% loss, 100% gain means you got twice as much, which is nice. But 100% loss is death. So, and there's that kind of nonlinearity is true in economics, psychology, neuroscience, and Kahneman's book. So that
Thank you,
I
Mike.
leave the balance of my time, yield the balance of my time.
Appreciate, gladly accepted. Appreciate it. Thank you. Next up is Steph.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sherry and Rob and Maritza, and of course, Shirkant. Sorry, I'm messing up your name. I thought this was absolutely fascinating, the juxtaposition between the last meetup, literally right before this, on neuroscience, because and I looked up Romantic Manifesto, haven't read it, but I see that it came out in 1969. In the last meetup, Sanjay was saying that 50 years ago, really, neuroscience began. So I wonder what Rand would think now. Also, Sanjay said in 30 years, because of AI, we're going to have robots that can have consciousness. So I just always like to think about the trajectory of history and where things fit in. And this has been fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you, Steph. So Marisa, Sherry, and Rob, any closing remarks?
Oh, you start.
Okay. Well, one thing I wanted to make sure I got in here, because this chapter is very, very strong on Ayn Rand insisting on the idea of not just going through sense of life, but doing the explicit conscious thinking. She's emphasizing that a lot. So I want to also add something on the other end, which is that a passage that jumped out at me from that she didn't mean in any way to denigrate sense of life or to downgrade its usefulness. And this analogy Sherry had of it, since listening to things in stereo, there are two tracks. I think that's really important. That what jumped out at me in that respect is a passage in Atlas Shrugged, where a woman says to one of the characters, "Well, I can't answer the arguments you're making. Can't show you how you're wrong logically, but I just feel that it's wrong." And then she walks off, and this character, Francisco d'Anconia, for those who've read the novel, says to Hank Rearden, "You're making the same mistake as that woman, but in the opposite direction," which is that she is putting her feelings above her thinking, whereas Rearden is the one who's constantly sacrificing his feelings and disregarding his feelings to his conscious thoughts about what he's supposed to be doing. And in doing so, he's missing important information. The sense of life is trying to tell him, essentially, the sense of life is trying to tell him things that he's not listening to. So she also had that idea that you have to take both. Your sense of life is a reaction based on the sum of your experiences to real facts that are happening out there. And so constantly being able to ask, what am I feeling, and why am I feeling this? And what is the basis for that? Is not just a way to say, oh, I can reprogram and get rid of this inconvenient emotion. It's also the fact that sometimes those emotional reactions are telling you something about the world that you need to listen to. But I think at least the broadest theme I think people would take from this chapter in particular is, I think there's something incredibly empowering about this, is the idea that, your emotional background of your life, the sense of life that you have, the habitual way you have approaching things, that's something that's under your control, that it's something that you can think about and understand. It's not under, like I said, it's difficult to change it, but you can do the work of introspecting and understanding what is it that I feel about things, how is it affecting my actions, how did I come to this, is it really true, and understanding what do I feel and why, knowing that you can do that you can engage in that introspection and actually succeed at understanding it is tremendously empowering, as opposed to this idea that, well, you're just stuck with whatever you have. This is just the way I am, and there's nothing I can do about it.
Excellent. Sherry and Marissa. Yeah. Sherry, go ahead.
I would like to add to that. introspection that we're talking about here of looking into your own sense of life will start paying serious dividends really in this very next chapter when we're talking about art and sense of life. And the more you consciously review your own reactions to works of art, negative and positive, the more you understand the art and the more valuable that art becomes for you. So it's a really wonderful feedback loop that you're going to get from it too. And the second thing I wanted to say was to thank all of you for coming, because this is quite a treat for us too, to be able to talk with people from, and I'm not, we forgot to ask Shrikant where everybody's from, but it's
everywhere.
Quite
Everywhere. We've got people from Australia, we got people from Spain, we got, you know,
last week from Norway. So it was great fun to talk with you all from wherever you are in your own little box, your Zoom box, and connect in the middle of this pandemic. So thank you all for coming.
Wonderful. Marisa.
I echo Sherry's thank you, because this is really fascinating and enlightening. It's kind of awesome to be a panelist and still be soaking up so much knowledge and information as well. And for me, I have a quote here, and I'm not gonna lie to you, I don't remember from whom I got it. I think it's from the Ayn Rand Institute. And it says, literature gives us heroes. It gives us men and women with stylized souls who exemplify virtue and dramatize the extent of human possibility. They become our moral standard bearers, leading the way to a life fulfilled. And that quote is what I would say, that's the kind of literature that I'm looking for. But the main point is that that's a great aspiration, but we can't find it unless we look at all flavors of literature. And I think that that's one of the most important things. I feel like poor Ayn Rand gets a bad rap for people saying, oh, she's so limiting. But she's actually, in this chapter specifically, she's saying all art is for showing your sense of life, or the artist's sense of life. All art will reveal to you, the viewer, aspects of your own sense of life and the sense of life in part of the artist.
So for me, this chapter demonstrates why I like Romantic Manifesto, why this is my favorite book by Ayn Rand. Because her purpose was to create these heroes, you know, of creating John Galt, creating Howard Roark. And she worked very hard to do it. And this is her technology. She's showing you how the technology of doing it. And because of nature of art, that has to really draw upon new science of what is going on within human beings. So see what we did today with this concept of sense of life. This is a tool. This is not just about art. This is a fundamental tool for looking at yourself, of saying, what is your sense of life and what is your philosophy? It gives you a very deep way of looking at yourself and saying, I mean, not at a surface level of why am I reacting to this particular thing, but what is the general way in which I'm reacting to everything? So it gives you an angle on figuring out your actual philosophy by which you're operating, your implicit philosophy, and puts it, as Rob put it beautifully, it makes a variable. It makes it that it is transformable. So it's a amazing thing. And she just does things like this during this book. So I'm delighted to have all of you along for exploration of the book. I strongly recommend that you read the book, because you would get 10 times the value. You'll get amazing amount of value in each of the meetups, even if you don't read it, but you'll get 10 times the value if you're reading it yourself. All right, folks. So thank you very much. Thank you for the panel. Thank you, panelists, and we'll see you next week. Have a nice evening.